Why has Dead by Daylight succeeded where all others have failed? This question has really intrigued me for some time now about how there have been so many attempts to make a rival asymmetrical horror game that have failed, despite every single one claiming that it will finally topple Dead by Daylight with its toxic player base and annoying metas. First off, I'll give my personal definition for what I'll be defining as an asymmetrical horror game so we can all be on the same page here. An asymmetrical horror game in general is any game where the players involved don't all have the same objectives, such as Among Us, It Takes Two, We Were Here, and Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. Everyone has their own tasks that still relate to the other players involved to either help or go against them. Asymmetrical horror games, therefore, are thought about as killers versus survivors, like Dead by Daylight, where one side is working together to complete objectives and escape while the killer, or sometimes killers, are trying to stop them. Technically, Among Us and some similar games could fit here, but I would consider it more of its own genre of social deduction games, like Town of Salem and Spy Party, since you're trying to find out who the killer is. Probably the clearest data showing this is the Steam player counts for a few of these games, which keep in mind these games could have more players on game stores outside of Steam, so the numbers could be slightly higher, but I think it still shows the trend really well, especially since Steam is the most popular game store. To start off with, we gotta talk about Dead by Daylight, of course. At the time of recording, the 24-hour peak of players for the game is 44,000, and the all-time peak is 105,000. So definitely keep those numbers in mind as we continue along here through this list. I'll try to go through these fairly quickly. First off, we have Video Horror Society. This one was a pretty big one. That was pretty hyped up. It's supposed to be a lot better, add a lot more fun mechanics. But though it has a 24-hour peak of 219 and an all-time peak of 4,000. Depth, which was an asymmetrical horror game of sharks versus scuba divers, basically, has a 24-hour peak of 78 and an all-time peak of 10,000. Friday the 13th, the game, has a 615 24-hour peak and a 16,000 player all-time peak. This one's kind of an exception, I'll definitely say, because there were some like legal issues with the authors or who owned the rights to Friday the 13th and stuff. So content for the game basically stopped right on launch. So they're just legally, it was out of their hands and they legally weren't able to add more to the game. So that one's a bit of an exception because that one seemed pretty good, but it's still what it is. Prop Night, which was a game that was very similar to Dead by Daylight, but though added a prop hunt aspect to it for the survivors, has a 24-hour peak of 500 players and an all-time peak of 4,000. I couldn't find the numbers for Ash vs. the Evil Dead, the game, since it's only on Epic Games, but the subreddit for the game does have 22,000 members, so that could get like a rough estimate for how many people at least were interested in the game and want to keep up with it. But I haven't really heard much about the game since its release. I've kind of heard like some mixed things, especially since it sounds like there's been kind of a lack of content for the game. Secret Neighbor, which was an asymmetrical horror game based off of Hello Neighbor, has a 24-hour peak of 197 players and an all-time peak of 5,000. Last year, The Nightmare has a 24-hour peak of 7 and an all-time peak of 198. I saw a lot of videos about this game, so I don't know why that's incredibly low, but maybe it's just like absolutely dead on release or something. I'm not sure exactly what happened to that one. Predator Hunting Grounds has a 24-hour peak of 83 and 1,500 for the all-time peak. And then White Noise 2, which was a bit of a smaller, more indie asymmetrical horror game, has a 24-hour peak of 5 players and an all-time peak of 163. So as you can see, it's definitely not the greatest track record for these games. And on top of that, keep in mind that Dead by Daylight is roughly 7 years old. I think it's going to have its anniversary soon. And it still reigns way over the genres, even its current player count is way over that of the all-time peaks of some of these other games. Obviously, the reasons for exactly why each game died varies, but here are some of my thoughts for as why as a whole it is difficult for games in this genre to succeed, rather than discussing each game individually. First off, balancing. This is the most difficult part of the majority of multiplayer games in general, to make sure that one weapon or strategy isn't too over or underpowered. This obstacle is even more extreme in asymmetrical horror games, since it leads to one side not having any fun and unable to play the game much. You can imagine if the killer is really overpowered, then the survivors are going to keep constantly getting killed and not be able to do anything. If the survivors are too strong, and the killer's just going to get frustrated. Dead by Daylight still struggles with this after all these years, and being a larger company than most of these other games I've listed, and constantly deals with balancing out the perks and killer abilities, but new metas still pop up. Like just recently they had a massive rework to all the, not all the perks, but majority and a lot of the perks and some of the killer abilities even. With that being said though, the game does do a good job as a whole with balancing despite these difficulties or how much I or other people may complain about it. it is good for how difficult this genre is. On the other hand, the majority of these games that I've mentioned were not as lucky since they've not had years to nail down this formula and instead are trying to work with their new mechanics that they also add on top of it. This is especially seen in Virtual Horror Society, or also known as VHS, where I've heard a lot about the queues being long because more people are playing survivors rather than killer because of the sides being imbalanced. It makes sense that this is a difficult formula to perfect, since you want to make the killer side feel powerful despite being outnumbered and for the survivors to have to work together to outwit the killer. In a roughly perfect game, the win-loss ratio between the killer and survivors, or just really for any multiplayer game for the different sides, should be around like 50-50. So that's why both sides kind of have equal chance of winning or not winning. And by that, I don't necessarily mean that like all the survivors have to escape to win, or the killer has to kill everyone to win. I think it should roughly, during gameplay, should be about like 50-50 chance of each person dying or being able to escape. So some games you get everyone, some games you get a couple, but as long as it's kind of in that average. But though with as many factors of perks, maps, abilities, objectives, obstacles, etc. all adding into this, it becomes very clear why this is a never-ending problem of constant balancing. Without the experience and a large enough testing community, these indie developers struggle to make both sides equally fun to play without one side or strategy overpowering the others. The next reason for a lot of these games is lack of content. This can both be at launch or continued content for the game. If at launch there's not enough variety of playstyles, or different content, or killers, or objectives, then the players will quickly get bored and move on before there can even be more content added in the future, killing the game before it can even gain traction. The opposite side of this is also true, where if the game is good at the start and can have lots of content, but though if it only receives a couple updates that maybe add a little bit, or are extremely spread out and very rare or sporadic, then this will eventually lead to there being no further updates since they cannot keep the community involved as much as possible. Which this all depends on the developers on how much care they want to give the game, or also just how much they're allowed to if their publisher cuts them off from adding more, or if just financially they are not able to support this. Consistent and sizable updates are vital to a game's long-term success, which is something that indie developers usually cannot afford to do, again, either because the financial issues of the problem or just the size of the team, especially if the game isn't growing. If it starts out small and then the game starts to grow, then obviously they can have more wiggle room to add more to the game and show more care for it. But if that's just not the case and it stays small, stays stagnant, then they're just really not able to, because it's better for them to just move on to bigger and better projects. Lastly, new content also brings new balancing challenges that can lead to more patches that just pile on top of any previous issues with balances. And if they're a small development team, that could also lead to more bugs, so they're also going to need bug patches. So more content isn't always necessarily the greatest thing for a game because it can also just end up breaking things entirely or making a nightmare for the development team. Another thing that ties into both the previous points is a system of progression. A lot of these asymmetrical horror games have some interesting gimmick that pulls people in, such as Prop Night being mixed with a prop hunt gameplay or based off a popular franchise like Predator or Hello Neighbor. But once the novelty wears off, there has to be a system for the player to progress and work towards. For example, in Dead by Daylight, since that's the main talking game here, having the blood web, lots of survivors and killers, a wide variety of perks, and especially a big thing that keeps bringing back players as just, it's something simple, but it works though, is the challenges. That there's like a new set of challenges. I think it's roughly every month or so. And all you get at the end of the challenge is some like little trinket that you can put on your character or on the hook, depending on who you're playing as. So it doesn't actually give you any benefits, and nor do progression doesn't have to give you benefits that are actually beneficial to you. It's just some goal that like you can set for yourself and try to achieve during gameplay. So that's why it actually gives you a reason for what you're doing rather than just randomly playing for the fun of it. Which like of course you want to be playing a game randomly just for the fun of it because you enjoy the game, but it just gives you that little extra motivation that can help bring players back or keep them playing a little bit longer. Many of these other games have a small list of characters, and most of the main content can be quickly unlocked or are already all unlocked, so the players don't have to do much other reason in the game than just to play it because there isn't any long-term goals to actually keep them playing and keep them interested in the game. The final reason is that Dead by Daylight just simply has such a strong foothold and large player base within the genre of asymmetrical horror games. Even if some of that player base transfers over to one of these similar games that claim to be better and fix the problems of Dead by Daylight, the the majority of them will most likely return to what is familiar to them once they either get bored or Dead by Daylight has some new content drop, while the other game doesn't. It's hard for an indie developer to be able to offer anything that truly rivals the foundation that Dead by Daylight has set as the king of the genre. The similar situation can be seen in other genres such as arcadey multiplayer first-person shooters like Call of Duty being the long-reigning king of that genre, without any other game being able to challenge it much, or at least if anything does, they don't have much success. Even the large franchise of Battlefield, which is slightly different since they have larger maps and stuff, is still not able to get anywhere near the player numbers that Call of Duty is able to get, even though they release a new game every single year that's almost the same game each time. I feel like loyalty to certain games is a very overlooked part when discussing the success of games that try to challenge a genre, because people are almost always more likely to return to what they are comfortable with and familiar, even if they've always talked about how much they even dislike the game or its player base. People really like to go back to their comfort games and what they know and what they already liked and what is already foundational for them. Especially if the game has been around for long enough, then nostalgia is added on top of that, giving longtime players even more, which is even sometimes a subconscious reason, to continue playing the old game rather than the new, remembering all the good memories that they've had the game, and also all their experience that they've already gained. So with all that in mind, I think we can see why so many asymmetrical horror games have failed where Dead by Daylight has succeeded. I don't think the majority of these dead games were necessarily bad or didn't have any care put into them by the developers. I'm not trying to like trash on them or say they're crappy or anything. I'm just trying to say that it is an incredibly difficult genre to succeed in and it is an incredibly complex formula to make the game both enjoyable for all sides and to be successful in the long term. And with all that being said, one final note, screw literally anyone that teabags after every single time they drop a pallet. You're not cool. No one cares. No one saw it. Clip it, post on metal, share with your one friend, whatever. I'm going to go play some Vampire Survivors to regain my dopamine from playing like freaking 2 rounds of Dead by Daylight. Hello everyone. I hope you enjoyed the first of my organized rambling type videos. I decided that this would flow a little bit better if I slap this little intro in at the end. This video definitely took a little bit more preparation since I actually like wrote a script for it, try to get like some data for it since I'm not just, it's supposed to be organized rambling. It's not just me rambling off facts that I didn't actually look at or take some time to actually fact check or anything. And that'll be for the rest of these videos. So since it took a little bit more time, these won't be like super frequent that I'll do these, but I do have multiple ideas that I do really want to do. So if you do like this style of video, they will be more coming. I just thought that talking about these like asymmetrical horror games, I just thought it was a really interesting topic to start off with, since I did a Dead by Daylight video, and it is just kind of strange that there's like, it's such a popular genre, yet no one else has really tried in like a major way to do it. There is that Chainsaw Massacre game coming out soonish or sometime this year. That one might be good, so I'll definitely probably do a video of that game once it comes out. But I think that is all I have for now, so I will see y'all later.